Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast NFL season preview series. The train continues to roll down the tracks. 4 previews already completed. If you haven't already checked those out, encourage you to do so. Today, it's all about the AFC South and who can win this muddled mess. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by professional sports bettor, my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, this is where it starts to get interesting, my friend. 4 podcasts down, 4 to go, and we are spending quality time in the South both today and coming up on Monday.
The South treats you well, typically. You like coming to the South.
Look, I've had plenty of good times in Nashville. We'll hope Titans fans feel the exact same way about the football team that they'll put on the field this year. Have not been to Jacksonville, and it's been a long time since I've been to Indianapolis. Not a whole lot to lure me there for Big Ten championship games between Iowa and Michigan.
Well, this is the division that gets us over the hump. Complete this one, and we're past the halfway point. This division, oof.
Can we say Can we say intriguing for all the wrong reasons here? Not to play spoiler in all of this.
We joked off air a couple moments ago, and you start to go through these teams, and it's difficult, right? Like I mentioned last time, these previews, like we have all the data, we're digging into all this stuff on a daily basis, but kind of putting it into a manner which is a little bit more absorbable for listeners. Like it's an undertaking, it's labor intensive, and so you start to go through this, and you're like, I mean, there's 3 teams that simply aren't competing, to win anything significant. And you're like, hey, we want to shortchange this a little bit, but effectively, we set the bar of content creation, so you're kind of just fighting yourself. And as you know, you always have new listeners to every episode, so we don't want to shortchange first-time listeners who are coming to get a good preview of the Texans or the Titans or the Colts. So, here we are. A lot of wormholes to go down when teams have some issues like these ones do.
No doubt about it. We'll do our best to uncover the strengths, the weaknesses, the warts that are here. But I did have one message to pass along, Payne, because remember, when we talk about the AFC South, one of your biggest fans, a guest that we've had on this podcast before, goes, you better not shortchange the Tennessee Titans. So Slay has laid down the gauntlet for us here. He's already trying to count his money on this team winning outright week 1 against the Saints. So I joked with him yesterday. I go, you know what's going to happen? The Saints will win that game by 1 point. You'll bet the Titans on the money line and find a way to middle yourself with your homerism getting in the midst of things. But 14...
I had to go to the internet to find out the scoop on Traylon Burks.
Look,
I mean, Slay's got to start delivering information.
They still don't know. I picked on them on air. They go, you'll know as soon as we know. I go, well, you guys don't know anything. That's why we have the good Doc Deepak to share some of his perspective later on in the program, albeit 24 hours removed from a knee injury that saw the sophomore wide receiver limping off the field after mixed scrimmages with the Minnesota Vikings. But before we get to the Titans, we'll start, as we always do, in alphabetical order, which by my ABCs means the Houston Texans will kick things off. And when you look at Houston...
That degree just paying off.
Hey, look, you don't take out 6 figures in student loans without knowing the ABCs, buddy. Let's put it that way. The Houston Texans win total 6.5, shaded to the under throughout the market. They find themselves as division long shots here at a price just shy of 10-1. And if you believe in miracles and C.J. Stroud taking them to the promised land, 200-1 or thereabouts will get you to win the Lombardi Trophy, and roughly half that to win the AFC. And as far as the Texans are concerned, I mean, this is a franchise desperately looking for direction. They have not had more than 4 wins in each of the last 3 seasons. They bring in DeMeco Ryans and for the first time in a while offer a longer-term deal, since obviously this roster rebuild won't happen overnight given the current construction. The 1-year deals of David Culley 2 years ago. Lovie Smith is the placeholder who gave the big FU, winning week Week 18 against the Indianapolis Colts. The problem for this Texans team, though, still a ton of dead cap money. They have to figure out what they're going to do with an aging roster. But their win total of 6.5 is the highest preseason number for this team going all the way back to 2020. They brought in a bunch of free agents. There's a little bit of youth infused in this roster. But Payne, first and foremost, before we get into the offense and defense, were you a fan of the D'Amico Ryans hire, and do you think he's the head coach that can restore this franchise that was a perennial playoff team back to its rightful place down there in the AFC South?
It's a great question. I'm unsure. It's wait and see. You certainly like an adult in the room, someone that has some great pedigree over the last few seasons, who we brought in at offensive coordinator, and we'll get to him in a moment. All of those things look pretty good. There's a commitment, clearly, right? I mean, you mentioned it, the last couple of head coaches, they were going to be pretty much one and dones. They were placeholders. So you're at least pushing the organization in the right direction. You go out, you get your hopeful elite pass rusher, you get your hopeful franchise quarterback, and you start kind of chipping away at this thing. And obviously there's room to grow in the AFC South. So I don't mind the hire. Again, in general, I'm not hiring defensive coordinators as my head coach. Like, the way the league's trending, it's an offensive league now. And so I'm always going out of my way to hire an offensive coach, because I know that he's going to be there. It's going to be his offense. When you hire a defensive coordinator and the offensive coordinator is fantastic, you're probably hiring a new guy inside of 2 or 3 seasons, and you're constantly having to perfect the hiring process. So in general, I'm not a guy that's hiring defensive coordinators.
It makes a ton of sense as a philosophy. You want your one common denominator to stay the same, and if you could put points on the board, you can get away with some of your defensive shortcomings. You mentioned the Texans' offense, and the man they brought in for the job at offensive coordinator is Bobby Slowick. He comes from the Shanahan coaching tree, so you can expect more running than a full aerial assault, especially with a young quarterback. When we look at the Texans last year, I mean, this was a team that loved to pound its head into the wall. They had an offensive line that showed flashes, but for the most part, Dameon Pierce wasn't exactly given a ton of running lanes to try and take advantage of. They had erratic quarterback play at best that they'll hope to stabilize. It's probably going to take some time if C.J. Stroud ultimately wins the job out of camp ahead of Davis Mills. But when you look at the quarterback spot, I mean, the Houston Texans weren't necessarily connected to a quarterback in all the build-up to the draft. They end up selecting C.J. Stroud there. They trade back into the top 3 to get a defensive difference maker that we'll get to in a moment. But when we look at Stroud, we look at some of the playmakers offensively. Payne, the one thing that stood out to me, and I couldn't agree more with the statement that was made, C.J. Stroud is going to find life in the NFL to be difficult, not because he won't be capable, but because he won't have the same caliber of wide receivers at his disposal in his rookie season, or maybe the immediate future in Houston, that he did have during his time wearing the scarlet and gray in Columbus.
I think all of that's correct. I mean, everything you kind of highlighted there are the overarching talking points to the Houston Texans offense. You have to give a vote of confidence to Bobby Slowick just based upon who he's worked with. And it's not just Shanahan, but he's been with Shanahan virtually every step of the way. Last 6 seasons in San Francisco, he started with him in Washington. And I think you kind of remove some of the quirky sound bites of Mike McDaniel. I mean, Slowick talks about offense the same way McDaniel does. And supposedly Slowick said that McDaniel taught him so much that they worked together, every day from 2019 to 2021. And so we saw the success Mike McDaniel had with the Dolphins offense. And I think people immediately, think that that's going to happen here in Houston. I think, as you kind of project out, I know we're giving like a year-over-year uptick in Houston's offensive projection, but listen, what I've heard internally is far more motion, quick screen game, still a willingness to take shots, but that run game certainly is going to be there with Dameon Pierce. We've heard positives from Pierce and O-linemen like Kenyon Green publicly about this offense. C.J. Stroud obviously has more talent in his pinky toe than Davis Mills, but this isn't going to look good right away.
How dare you talk so poorly about a former Stanford starting quarterback over there?
So, I kind of want to frame this in the right context that, Slowick is obviously learning to become a play designer and a play caller on his own. And that's a large step. And you have players learning new systems. And Lermy Tunsil and Titus Howard and Shaq Mason did not play. Those were Houston's 3 key cogs up front. Dameon Pierce is Houston's lead back, did not play. So C.J. Stroud didn't have a ton of help in his preseason opener. But from what I watched, and the film was worse than watching it live, the play design was not good. Rarely anything was made to make life easy on C.J. Stroud. The route tree stunk. There were 7-step drops. Felt like I was watching, Kerry Collins circa 2002. And then you kind of hinted at some of the deficiencies we might see from C.J. Stroud right off the bat, but it was pretty clear like he wasn't seeing things, and suddenly he had bad feet, which I didn't really get the vibe of at Ohio State. And then the decision-making wasn't great. There's a 3rd and 24 situation where Stroud throws a pick on an 11-yard route when the check down's wide open. Like, if you're not pushing it to the sticks, why take the risk? So I didn't expect it to look good, but it didn't look remotely competent across the board. And I think, clear transition here. We know what C.J. Stroud is, right? He's got the arm talent, was really good going through progressions and showed good processing speed at Ohio State, was really accurate to virtually every level of the field. But your main talking point is like the question mark in the CJ Stroud projection to the NFL level is, one, defensive strength of opponent, and then normalizing that receiver talent. And I think we talked on our college football show that the Big Ten doesn't have the best athletes, right? They don't have like the fastest guys, the most athletic guys at the skill positions, right? And one of the most decorated corners in the Big Ten the past few seasons was Riley Moss, and most NFL scouts thought of him as a safety this past draft.
Yep.
So, C.J. Stroud isn't thrown to Garrett Wilson or Marvin Harrison Jr. or Olave or Smith and Jigba, who are so wide open. A lot of those passes looked like converting an uncontested layup. And so this is just going to look very different for C.J. Stroud weapon-wise. Nico Collins is the holdover. Houston went out and signed the Cowboys wide receiver 3 and Noah Brown, signed veteran Robert Woods. There aren't any field stretchers in that trio. There aren't any separators in that threesome. And, you look at Nico Collins, he was outside the top 50 in target separation. Noah Brown and Robert Woods both outside the top 60 last season. So, Houston's going to need a guy like Tank Dell to provide some juice from time to time as a rookie, and then Mechie, to return to form after a long layoff. Kudos to him to kicking cancer's ass there. But, he hasn't played in 18 months or so. And then you look at what's in front of C.J. Stroud. Pretty interesting. You have Tunsil and Titus Howard, very good pass blockers. Tunsil was the very best last season, allowed a 2% pressure rate. Both tackles are replacement level at best, creating push in the ground, and then Titus Howard dealing with a little bit of an injury to his hand. But the Texans were 31st in line yards created, 30th in generating yards before first contact, and 27th in run block win rate. So you see Houston goes out, makes the trade for Shaq Mason. Makes a world of sense. He's a mauler. 5 seasons of elite run blocking. But side by side, Houston's going to start rookie center Juice Scruggs, who, if you watched, struggled with power at the college level. And then second-year guard Kenyon Green, who graded out 86th among 87 qualifying guards last season.
At least he wasn't last.
The goal here is you need C.J. Stroud in the pass game to be competent enough to open some things up for the run game, right? And Houston quarterbacks had the lowest air yards per attempt in the NFL last season, well under 6 yards. Dameon Pierce didn't know what a normal box count was. Every defense was able to play in a phone booth and cheat run against Houston. And, of course, the Texans faced the 4th highest rate of loaded boxes in the NFL because of that. So C.J. Stroud needs to be a threat, and I think that opens up a little bit more space, makes, life easier on the offensive line to create space with fewer bodies in the box as well. Dameon Pierce's life becomes easier. This isn't an overly difficult schedule of defenses Houston plays, which is nice when you're undertaking this massive transition, but it's certainly tougher than last year. And the Texans didn't register a single game over EPA expectation, and that was the 4th easiest schedule of defenses. So it's one thing to improve, which we expect. It's another to have that improvement reach a point in year 1 where you can actually be competitive, and that's kind of my my question mark about this offense in Houston Texans team in general.
You know, it's always interesting, and we talk about this doing both college and pro football. When you look at quarterbacks and try and assess guys that are surrounded with 5-star recruits, taking on some inferior skill position players and talent on the outside, then you get C.J. Stroud to flash against Georgia, but that wasn't a Georgia defense that we held in the highest regard in terms of some of their secondary pieces either. And you wonder, when you don't have that separation, can you throw guys open? Can you anticipate? Because it does become a stark shock to the system when you're playing against the Northwesterns and Indianas of the world on a week-in, week-out basis, when suddenly you have to work against elite cover corners that are going to blanket some of your guys. So we'll see how that plays out. No doubt a learning curve expected for the talented pivot out of Ohio State. Defensively for the Houston Texans, Payne, Matt Burke will be the one calling the shots as defensive coordinator. This was a group that allowed the most rushing yards on a per-game basis in the league last year. When you look at philosophy-wise what this team wants to do, they want an aggressive defensive line and get after the quarterback. I mean, look, that's what most teams want. It's what led to a lot of the success that San Francisco was able to have with D'Amico Ryans as their DC, and it's part of what led them to trade a lot of draft capital up into that 3rd overall spot to bring in Will Anderson to try and bolster that group. You get a couple of veterans in Sheldon Rankins that try and help despite being an aging talent. We'll see what he can do alongside Malik Collins, but there's a lot of older pieces that are expected to perform at a high level, especially on that defensive line and in the linebacker room. And maybe if there's a breath of fresh air, it's that youth that flashed from time to time in the secondary with guys like Derek Stingley Jr., another top 5 pick, Jalen Petrie out of Baylor. But as you assess the Houston Texans defense, do you see their pieces to be excited about and some of the pieces that really concern you about them being able to hold up in the trenches on a week-in, week-out basis?
Some needs to be greater than the parts. And that's D'Amico Ryans' job. He's been one of the more respected defensive minds the past few seasons with some of his creativity, but he had gobs of talent in San Francisco that he doesn't have yet in Houston. And, you know, in late July, there were articles saying D'Amico Ryans would call defensive plays. And then my source tells me, I practiced last week, it's been Matt Burke calling the defense. So not D'Amico, right? I think that's something to monitor here. Again, not a lot of talent, but the positives are Houston projects to face one of the easiest schedules of offenses across the board, from passing to pass protection. Scheme-wise, there's things D'Amico does that the Texans did well last season. I mean, Houston's secondary was fantastic when playing zone. They allowed the lowest completion percentage over expectation in the league when in zone coverage. And, you know, D'Amico's certainly going to be far more multiple than Lovie Smith was. But if you look, D'Amico's 49ers played zone at a very high rate. Too high, 55% of defensive snaps. The 49ers defense only played man coverage 20% of the time, was the 3rd lowest man rate in the NFL. So the transition in coverage probably isn't going to be a massive undertaking. Guys can hit the ground running pretty quickly. There's a nice group of veterans in the back from, you know, a secondary that was above average in schedule-adjusted pass defense. Jimmy Ward follows D'Amico over from San Francisco, one of the better run-defending, tackling safeties. He's improved in coverage as well the last 4 seasons. Steven Nelson returns, was top 10 in coverage yards allowed per coverage snap. Desmond King regained his early career form with the Chargers. Shaq Griffin was brought in for depth. And you mentioned Derek Stingley. Struggled a little bit as a rookie, not surprising. Really wasn't a scheme fit. You remember that? We're like, boy, that's a weird cornerback to take if you're playing that system.
It was a guy that just kept climbing draft boards, and you knew about some of the talent that was there, but there is no doubt it was head-scratching, especially given some of the concerns and holes that Houston had to fill on that defensive side.
Yeah, I mean, you think about Stingley, he was really good early on in his LSU career, and then that tailed off, and he struggled with injuries, and everyone's like, we're not quite sure where he's going to go. He goes to the combine and workouts and just absolutely kills it, and he just shot up the boards. And sure enough, right, year one, we just saw it. Didn't fit the scheme well, battled injuries. So hopefully D'Amico can get Stingley back in form. You mentioned Jalen Petrie, versatile safety taken in round 2 last year. Took about 10 weeks to adjust to the NFL, but Petrie was a plus player from week 11 onward, so I think we see that year 2 bump. Linebacker group to me looks like a weakness, but there's only one direction to go. Rookie Christian Harris was thrown into the fire last season, and this is This is dead last. Graded out 93rd out of 93 qualifying linebackers. He was unplayable, but played over 700 snaps. The traits are there, though, right? It's like 4.4 speed at linebacker. We know how good the 49ers coverage backers were, so I think D'Amico makes Harris serviceable. Blake Cashman, 4 years in the league, 600 total snaps, below replacement level. Denzel Perryman is the veteran of the room, solid, box backer, liability and coverage, and then Henry To'oTo'o, 5th-round rookie out of Alabama, will be in the mix as well. You mentioned up front, the splash signing was Sheldon Rankins. Had a bounce-back year for the Jets last season. Really hasn't lived up to the potential, right? He was like the 12th overall pick, but solid player, big body guy to help the Texans defense that was small and got bullied last season. Houston was 28th in EPA per rush allowed on early downs the first 3 quarters, 27th in schedule-adjusted rush efficiency, and 27th in defensive line yards. So getting a big body in there certainly should help. Malik Collins was extended. He's heading into year 8. Poor run defender and tackler. I'm not sure why they signed him for that amount. He's a decent pressure guy from the inside. Hassan Ridgeway comes over from the 49ers, more of a rotational piece, really not much more. The Texans still, to me, look a little soft up the middle. And then you look at those 49ers defenses, how they were built, and then Robert Saleh, transitions to the Jets from that same 49ers defensive lineage, and it's like, you're going to see wide 9. That's what these ends are, right? Like, just from an edge rusher perspective, this is what you want. I would think it fits Will Anderson's game extremely well because he's got quick get off and power, and you just are kind of uninhibited when you set up very wide. He did a good job as well, Will Anderson, setting the edge at Alabama. I think the knock on Anderson's game is basically the toolbox of moves. Doesn't have a ton of them, but I think that probably grows over time. Jonathan Grenard dealt with a foot injury last season and just couldn't get to the quarterback. Jerry Hughes, you kind of hinted at being the old guy in the group. I just, defies father time, basically. 35 years old. He's a one-trick pony. The trick is fantastic. I mean,
you better be the best at what you do if you're going to be that old and continue to get meaningful reps in the National Football League.
15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps last season. But you just look past that 3 of, Anderson and Grenard and Hughes. I don't see much talent. Maybe like D'Amico can unlock Chase Winovich and get him back to his 2020 form. I think overall, Todd, I love that Houston appears to have adults in the room now. And, you get an offensive mind from Shanahan's coaching tree. And we see what D'Amico Ryans have done with the 49ers defense. And the South is the easiest division in the AFC. But Houston won 3 games last season, one of which they trailed by 7 with under a minute to go against the Colts, which they didn't want to win. Beat Jacksonville because they turned it over 5 times. And then they outlasted Tennessee, being +2 in turnovers. My vibe is the upgrades are being priced in too heavily early on. That's kind of my feel here.
Look, their win total, mentioned it. It's a lot more aggressive than what we've seen the last couple of years where they're consistently closing in that 4.5 range. Suddenly we're now out to 6.5 with increased levels of optimism. It's tough to go out there and watch that win total jump considerably, given there are a lot of questions that have to be answered, especially early on in the campaign. But no doubt, you think a team that was going to trend in the positive direction over the next couple seasons as they start to figure things out. Another team that drafted what they hope will be their franchise quarterback would, of course, be the Indianapolis Colts, and they made big news earlier this week, officially naming Anthony Richardson their Week 1 starting quarterback. When we look at the Colts' numbers as far as the betting markets are concerned, their win total, 6.5, shaded to the over. They find themselves as the 3rd shot within the division at a price just shy of 7-1 to win the South. And if you're looking at the big picture markets, right around 60-1 the going rate for the AFC, and well into the triple digits to win the Lombardi Trophy. Anthony Richardson, interesting comments in being named the QB1 for Week 1, saying he was shocked by the decision. I know there was a lot of talk that Gardner Minshew's familiarity with the system could allow him to take reps initially, but clearly this team knows that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And as you begin to look at the 32nd ranked offense of where they finished the season last year, they were extremely healthy, Payne, so they can't use injury as an excuse like a lot of teams I mean, this was a group that just couldn't do anything to get out of their own way. We know the ongoing saga with Jonathan Taylor. We can get into that if you want. But some of the underlying numbers that we saw from Indianapolis were absolutely horrific. And I think the biggest issue that emerged seemingly out of nowhere for this group a season ago was an offensive line largely lauded as their building block that looked a lot more like Matadors, making Matt Ryan, Sam Ehlinger, and anyone else who took reps under center a sitting duck for the Indianapolis Colts.
Well, yeah, before we get there, I think if you're the Indianapolis Colts, it's a positive that you've welcomed this transition, right? And I thought it was pretty clear who was going to be their guy behind center. I mean, once Shane Steichen got the Indy job and Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud were going 1-2 in some order, it was pretty foregone that Anthony Richardson would be Steichen's guy based on what landed Steichen, this career job of his, right? It was a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts. So that pairing, wasn't surprising.
Yep.
And it's hopefully going to lead these guys, to a little bit more of a forward momentum long term. I think there's no question Anthony Richardson has upside to be whatever he wants in this league, that the potential is untapped. I mean, he's the size of Cam Newton. He's got Josh Allen's arm strength. I mean, the relative athletic score, he effectively broke the charts with a perfect 10. If you're designing a freaking quarterback in the lab, right, like the size, the arm strength, the athleticism would, mirror Richardson's. It's just everything else has got to improve, and his baseline production at Florida wasn't good. And I think we believe Dan Mullen is a very good quarterback whisperer, and he couldn't fully unlock Anthony Richardson. Neither could Billy Napier. And granted, like, Florida's receivers were dreadful last season, so part of that issue with Richardson not growing as a passer was certainly on that receiver core. But, I mean, Anthony Richardson was 86th out of 87 qualifying quarterbacks in adjusted accuracy. And, the allure to Anthony Richardson is his own, mobility, and I think that creates an extremely high floor, and that's why these kids are starting earlier than ever before, because that baseline, you're immediately saying, hey, this is a guy that can provide 1,000 yards on the ground. Right. So if the offense, it has this floor to his performance because of that rushing ability. I mean, even like 2021, when you look at, Jalen Hurts, who struggled as a passer, I mean, the Eagles still had the 11th most efficient offense in the NFL because of Jalen Hurts' mobility. So that's kind of the thought process on Anthony Richardson starting away. And, you look across the board, Anthony Richardson's like 3 inches taller, 25 pounds heavier, and runs 4.3 and not 4.6. So like he's got those advantages on Jalen Hurts already. The ability to improvise is what's so, to me, appealing. And you think about, how an offense operates, and a play can be dog shit, right? It can be dead, but not with Anthony Richardson. He averaged 12.8 yards per rush on scrambles at the college level. It's an NCAA record. So it's everything else. It's kind of got to come together here. And I think the positive is like Shane Steichen's calling the plays. Shane Steichen went out and was forward thinking and hired Cam Turner to be Richardson's quarterback coach. And you kind of go down his path, and Cam Turner coached Cam Newton. He coached Kyler Murray. And so those are some positives to help Anthony Richardson grow. The Colts also project to face a bottom 5 schedule of passing defenses. And I think you mentioned some of the woes the Colts offensive line had last year. It's kind of been an underlying issue. Like, their tackle situation hasn't been great the past few seasons, and we've seen, guys like Quentin Nelson regress a little bit. But I think Anthony Richardson actually helps a really poor pass blocking offensive line that the Colts have, right? I mean, Indy was dead last in pass block win rate last year. Now, you pair that with a statue in Matt Ryan, like it's not a good combination. But I go back to those 87 qualifying college quarterbacks. Anthony Richardson was elite in sack avoidance. Only 9% of pressures turned into sacks. So that, to me, helps the offensive line immediately. The receiver room is interesting because I don't think anyone believes the Colts receiver group is great, but it could be better, right, for a guy like Anthony Richardson. You think about Michael Pittman, right? 6'4", 90th percentile catch radius, finished 17th in contested catch rate last season. Alec Pierce, right? 6'3", 96th percentile catch radius. You have a tight end in Jelani Woods who's 6'7", 98th percentile catch radius. Woods was 5th in contested catch rate last season. When you have a quarterback like the Colts have had in like previous years with like Phillip Rivers and Matt Ryan, who are accurate, you want run after the catch receivers. With Anthony Richardson, who's probably going to spray it a little bit, especially early on, you want tall, long, large catch radius receivers. But, I think that makes them a little bit more appealing this year, maybe. And then you do get your change of pace receiver. Josh Downs has been one of the best run after the catch guys at the college level. He's flashed in camp, could win that starting slot role. I think the offensive line is better too, not just with that help of Anthony Richardson, but you kind of look at some of the players there. You have a right tackle in Bernhard Raymond, right? Pleasant surprise as a third-round rookie. Played over 700 snaps. Finished the season on fire in pass protection. So hopefully, you get that transition into year 2. Quentin Nelson is coming off his worst season, right? There's only one direction to go. Ryan Kelly coming off a really poor season. Hopefully he can get back to that like 2018-19 level. Braden Smith is the best of the bunch at right tackle. Right guard Will Fries is the weak length, but he kind of had his best 3-game stretch to end last season. So again, like you're hoping for that carryover. You hinted at Jonathan Taylor. That's probably the biggest question mark. I mean, you kind of hear what's going on internally, like Chris Ballard saying Taylor isn't 100% from the surgically repaired ankle. Taylor claims he's holding out because he wants a trade. My best guess, it's a little bit of both, right? I'd guess Taylor isn't 100% healthy. My suspicion, though, is like Jonathan Taylor and his agent don't love the offensive scheme for his skill set, right? I mean, you think about him, right? Traditional Wisconsin Badgers running back. You fast forward to the NFL, Jonathan Taylor has been substantially more efficient when the quarterback's under center and not in shotgun and pistol, which Anthony Richardson's likely going to be in. So I don't know what that means. I mean, the data isn't good. It can change, right? I mean, Anthony Richardson's so good, you have to respect his skill set. And so, I mean, maybe Jonathan Taylor, starts seeing some lighter boxes. He starts seeing more success running from shotgun and pistol, but that hasn't been the case to this point. I want to see what this looks like. I mean, for the first time since like Andrew Luck, right, there's a possibility of upside that Carson Wentz and Matt Ryan didn't have. Matt Ryan was just such a poor fit. 28 turnovers in 12 games with so many like down-to-down negative plays along the way, right? And then there's like these catastrophic ones where like Indy allowed 5 defensive touchdowns. And so I think this is just going to be a little bit more competent here. And then you look like the Colts managed to win one of their 5 games where they had a fourth quarter win probability of 70%. And then again, from like a schedule perspective, not just like who the Colts play, but how that schedule lays out. It's one of the easiest in the league. And so for me, like I just look at this, Todd, it's like there's so much variance. Like if you said, hey, like O-line performs to last year's level, Anthony Richardson doesn't improve a lick as a passer, Jonathan Taylor just kind of mopes around this season, the Colts could win 4 games again. But there's also a scenario where the Colts O-line can only go in one direction. Jonathan Taylor looks good running from the shotgun because Anthony Richardson's like just such a run threat. Richardson goes for a Justin Fields like 1,000-yard season on the ground. The negative plays cut down because Richardson avoids pressure better than Matt Ryan. And then, the big catch radius targets help Richardson improve enough as a passer. And then the schedule is so relatively easy that the Colts are competitive enough in the AFC South, right? Like that becomes extremely plausible as well. So there's just, to me, a ton of variance here with the Colts.
If the offense performs to a level slightly above preseason expectation, clearly the defense will have to carry the water as well. This was a group that couldn't really generate pressure last year. You look on paper, arguably one of the worst cornerback rooms and secondaries in the entire league, but still some pieces to be excited about along the defensive line. Defensively for the Indianapolis Colts, we know Shaq Leonard basically sat out the entire season last year because of injury, played just 3 games after recovering from a nerve issue in his back. There's a lot of optimism that he can be a different guy. You did get Zaire Franklin to flash last year. We talked a little bit about Bobby Okereke leaving for the New York Giants. As far as a silver lining defensively for the Indianapolis Colts, is there a particular position group that you're optimistic about? Or on the flip side, is there a position grouping that you go, you know what? This group just has to go out there and not shoot themselves in the foot because there doesn't look to be a redeeming quality whatsoever.
I mean, there's a couple dudes here. There's a couple spots of strength. I was a little surprised Steichen retained Gus Bradley as his defensive coordinator. To me, that wasn't really a needle mover. I think Probably fair to say if you lined up all 32 defensive coordinators, Gus Bradley's somewhat middling. And up front probably is where the best horses are for the Colts. Like the majority of the front seven is back, and a piece or two that was lost was upgraded. So I think Gus Bradley has a decent amount to work with. DeForest Buckner is that guy. 16% tackle rate on runs, 11% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Grover Stewart was a top 10 guy in run stop win rate, and the guys, if you kind of hear how he's being talked up internally and at Colts camp, they think he's playing to a Pro Bowl level. Kwity Paye is the guy that needs a big year 3. Set the edge really well last season, but isn't an elite pressure guy, to your point. Less than a 10% pressure rate on pass rush snaps in the first 2 seasons for Kwity Paye. Samson Ebukam was, that was the big splash, right, in free agency. Kind of a pass rush specialist in L.A. and San Francisco the last 6 seasons, coming off his best year, above replacement level player. And then you have Deo, who was, the other 2021 edge draft pick after Kwity Paye. Rotational piece, I think a big third season for him as well, and he knows it, right? Added 11 pounds of good weight this offseason. But the edge pressure has to be better, right? Like, even though the Colts as a whole finished 14th in schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency last year, just could not get pressure. And you think about how that pairs with Gus Bradley's mindset. Like, he's not a guy who likes to manufacture pressure. 5th lowest blitz rate. 82% of snaps, Gus Bradley only rushed 4. So every defensive lineman played one-on-one effectively to get pressure, and they just didn't win enough. The Colts were 31st in pass rush win rate, bottom 10 in pressure rate overall. So, you got to have guys like Kwity Paye get to the next level and be a solid pass rusher. I think where the Colts defense sees an uptick is with his leader, right? Like, Shaq Leonard, first 4 seasons in the league were played to an extremely high level, only played 74 snaps, scattered over 3 games last year. I think it's a good sign that Shaq, played a few preseason snaps against Buffalo. When healthy, Shaq Leonard can do it all. He's the leader of the defense. Good run defender, elite tackler. You can send Shaq on blitzes. He's solid in coverage. Just has to stay healthy because Bobby Okereke moved on. Zaire Franklin finally had more responsibility last year. Looked at his first 4 seasons, only 465 snaps, played over 1,100 last year. Showed some flashes, to your point, but in totality, right, it was a below replacement level player. EJ Speed is the guy that's being talked about as the breakout player in this room. Yep. Just elite athleticism, shows good instincts. Let's see if he performs at last season's level with more snap share, because he really flashed but didn't play a ton of snaps. So you're like, is it going to be there if we increase his snap rate? So that's a guy to look for in that linebacker room is EJ Speed. The biggest question mark defensively is in the secondary, right? Like, on paper, it's a bottom 5 unit in the league, and when your front 7 struggles to get pressure, right, the area of concern becomes magnified. Stephon Gilmore traded to Dallas. Isaiah Rodgers was cut after getting some bets in. So you're losing, over 1,500.
Hopefully a listener to this podcast, although we don't condone breaking NFL rules to do so.
Man, they got to get that figured out, right? Like, just
it shouldn't
like
be
every
hard
other
to tell
work environment.
Yeah.
Like, you can't log on to that website from the facility, right? Like, it's blocked.
Just blacklist a website from the team facility. This shouldn't be rocket science.
No, but I mean, between Gilmore and Rodgers, like, that's over 1,500 snaps of extremely good corner play that's gone. And so, like, this season immediately comes down to, like, 2 key guys. You got the rookie, Julius Brents. He has got to be an impact guy day one. Elite athlete, tall, long, quick, nearly a perfect relative athletic score. Brents has been dealing with a hamstring and a wrist injury early in camp, so he's not quite getting the reps that you'd want to see from a rookie, kind of trying to get acclimated and hit the ground running. And then the second guy, Kenny Moore, he's got to return to form. I mean, worst season as a pro by a mile. The first 12 games were dreadful. Then he missed the rest of the season with an injury. But Kenny Moore graded out cornerback 131 out of 136 qualifiers in coverage grade. The other corner is, you look at that group that are kind of in position to play significant snaps, is you got a second-year undrafted guy in Dallas Flowers, second-year undrafted guy in Darrell Baker Jr., and then a 5th-round rookie in Darius Rush. So that's kind of scary to think about as your cornerback, too. Safety positions, interesting. Rodney McLeod was the best of the bunch last season, left in free agency. Julian Blackman switching to strong safety. It makes sense because he's been a great run defender his first 3 seasons, but a liability in coverage. Rodney Thomas, a surprise 7th rounder that played 700 snaps as a rookie. He's going to start at free safety, below replacement level though. Needs that sophomore surge. Safety depth is a serious concern. That's why you saw the Colts go out and sign Ronnie Harrison. I believe it was on Monday. So, for this, you look at this, right? Like for the Colts secondary not to be really poor, you need more pressure up front. Kenny Moore's got to return to being like that elite slot cover guy. Julius Brents has to be as advertised. Cornerback 2 can't be like a total liability. And then the safety combination of Blackman and Thomas has to play to a level that we haven't seen yet. Bottom 5 schedule of projected passing offenses, which should help, right? And then, if those things kind of don't happen, to me, like this could be one of the larger sieves through the air when you adjust for opponent.
The silver lining to the first 2 teams that we've broken down, the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts, the NFL schedule makers realize these 2 teams could struggle quite a bit. They play every single one of their games on Sundays, no Thursday night games, no errant primetime spots. We will miss some of those Thursday night lovely football games that we've seen in the past involving the Houston Texans getting boat raced by elite caliber competition, and the same thing with the Indianapolis Colts. But one final question before we get to the 2 division favorites I have to ask, Payne, knowing that the Colts and Texans are facing similar trajectories, both drafted what they think is going to be a franchise-changing quarterback inside the top 5, both have similar win totals in the 2023 season. Which team do you think is closer to where they want to be if you were looking over a 3-year runway?
Ooh, a 3-year runway. That's interesting. Obviously, Anthony Richardson has more upside than C.J. Stroud, in my opinion. And then they went with the offensive coordinator as their head coach, and Houston did not. Anderson really has to be that dude because they gave up a boatload of draft capital, right? This year, it's obvious, right? To me, like the higher upside team, the team that could potentially surprise a little bit more and eclipse the win total if there was one of those two. It's Indianapolis.
Yep.
They have more talent. 3 years out, I don't know. You're putting me on the spot there.
No, it's just something. I wasn't looking for a black and white answer there. Just something to think about when you look at 2 teams that obviously realize, hey, Jacksonville probably isn't going away, that they have the quarterback that they believe in Trevor Lawrence, but may have salary cap limitations that they need to navigate through. And of course, we'll get to the Jags. The Titans are a team that are figuring out their quarterback situation. So I think from a variety of those factors, when you look at these organizations, it's there for the taking if you build the right way and if you've landed your quarterback. So always interesting to, identify those teams.
Yeah, my understanding is like Chris Ballard's going to be a little bit different in how he operates, which is a positive. Again, I like the idea of an offensive mind as my head coach, and we kind of outlined some of Shane Steichen's abilities with the Philadelphia Eagles where, he took over in that regime's first year as the play caller about 7 or 8 weeks in, and the offense took off and Jalen Hurts improved under Shane Steichen. And then he goes out and gets his guy to kind of mirror that Jalen Hurts vibe. So there's at least some pedigree there that says, hey, this guy is shown to be able to develop quarterbacks. Hey, this guy is shown to be able to improve an offense when it's his. And we haven't quite have those same securities with the Houston Texans and who they've hired.
No, it makes a ton of sense. Look, there's a lot of things that go into making a franchise relevant. It's not just landing a franchise quarterback. It's not just landing a head coach. It's all of those pieces like a jigsaw puzzle that have to fit together to allow things to start scratching the surfaces. These franchises will look to try and do everything they can to rebuild. And right on cue, as if the Houston Texans' ears were bleeding with the showdown between D'Amico Ryans and Coach McDaniel, seeing money come in against Houston for their second preseason game this coming Saturday. You can follow Payne. I guess we're not calling it Twitter anymore, so we have to call it on X, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, encourage all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners, to subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter. It'll keep you abreast of everything going on all football season long, and oftentimes carries a little bit of bonus bet action to keep your bankroll in good standing throughout the fall. From teams,
let me ask you a question. How does Des Bryant's representatives not have X trademarked?
There's a lot of things that leave you scratching your head in all of this, but apparently Microsoft has X trademark though, but yet it hasn't changed the name of the app.
Okay.
So not quite sure how all this will play out, but we know Elon's got a lot more powerful lawyers on his team than we have on ours.
Yes.
So
Very
we'll
true.
see what we have. But the Jacksonville Jaguars, when we look at the team that was a surprise division winner last year, they went from worst to first, and a lot of that had to do with the Tennessee Titans implosion down the stretch. When we look at Jacksonville's season-long numbers, odds makers no dummies here, forcing you to pay a premium if you want to back the Jags in any capacity. They are the odds-on favorite to win the AFC South at minus $1.40, minus $1.50-ish. Their win total, 9.5, heavily shaded to the over at this juncture in the game. And when you look at the landscape of the AFC being given a ton of respect, right around a 15-1 shot to come out of the conference and slightly north of 30-1 to win the Lombardi Trophy. And I think the biggest question that you have to ask with a team that burst onto the scene maybe a little bit sooner than people anticipated, are they able to handle prosperity? And the Jags had the good fortune last year of one of the healthiest rosters in the league. But unlike some of the other teams that we've already broken down in the division, Payne, the Jags know they have their franchise quarterback in Trevor Lawrence. He's just starting to scratch the surface with what he's going to be able to accomplish as an NFL pivot and a face of a franchise. And they have an adult in the room that we know can work with offense in Doug Peterson. There are a lot of pieces from the skill positions to be excited about that leads you to believe Jacksonville can improve on some of the numbers that was almost like a tale of two seasons. While they struggled early with red zone efficiency, got significantly better. Everything came to a head. But if there's one question we have about this Jags offense, if they're going to get there, is with an offensive line that appears to be the biggest weakness, even with a talented quarterback under center.
So we expected real improvement from Trevor Lawrence and Jacksonville's offense last season, and we got it, right? I mean, we know Doug Peterson's offensive mind that is really good from his years with Andy Reid. And then when he went out on his own, right, like led a great Philadelphia offense, won a Super Bowl with Nick Foles. I mean, turned Carson Wentz, who isn't on an NFL roster right now, into an MVP caliber player. And, you know, like all the player quotes throughout last offseason were positive. So there were tons of data points and information that made it very clear the Jaguars offense would improve. And we invested in that improvement, right? Trevor Lawrence, under 14.5 interceptions, was a season-long prop that we gave out to our listeners last year. And, you know, like sure enough, Jacksonville's offense goes from 27th in schedule adjusted efficiency to 9th in Doug Peterson's first year. It didn't look great. You kind of hinted at this because we talked about it, I think, throughout last season as it's kind of progressing in front of our eyes. It didn't look great to start. It took some time, and you know, Trevor Lawrence was still growing into becoming a leader. And you mentioned some of those costly turnovers the first, 5 weeks or so, week 5 against Houston, and I think when we saw Trevor Lawrence make those early mistakes, he would pout a little bit, right? Body language wasn't good, and Doug Peterson was able to coach that out of him. And you could see Jacksonville's offense improving even in some of the losses. And I think we said like numerous times throughout the years, like, it kind of takes 8 to 10 weeks to get acclimated to a brand new system. And sure enough, right, like the light came on week 9. And so from week 9 onward, Jacksonville had the 4th most efficient schedule adjusted passing attack in the NFL, 3rd best early down offense. Individually, 38 quarterbacks played at least 100 snaps in the NFL from week 9 through 18. Trevor Lawrence only trailed Patrick Mahomes in passing success rate over that stretch. Lawrence was 5th in EPA plus completion percentage over expectation, number 1 in EPA per attempt against man coverage. So there was a massive improvement from Trevor Lawrence. Like you even look at like the basic metrics, like 5.5% increase in adjusted completion percentage year over year. We saw big time throw rate improve, turnover worthy plays decrease, touchdown rate more than doubled. And then if you've kind of been reading this offseason, Trevor Lawrence says that he has worked harder than ever before, reshaped his body, added 10 pounds of good weight. He's becoming a leader. Doug Peterson said Trevor's voice carries a lot of weight now, and that his confidence is through the roof, and that he's going to be one of the greats. So positivity, right, from Doug Peterson, the way Trevor Lawrence is working this year. You mentioned like what's around him weapon-wise. I think, adding Calvin Ridley into the fold is huge. And I know, like, not having played in 2 years, it leads people to maybe question his ability and, can he hit the ground running? But, like, read the reports. I mean, Ridley's been the star of Jaguars camp. He just moves at a different pace. You see some of these videos that are materializing coming out on the internet, and you're watching, like, the receiver group run routes. it looks different for Calvin Ridley. He's still in his prime at 28. The last full season in 2020, over 2.4 yards per route run. Like, at the very least, right? Ridley's a massive upgrade over Marvin Jones Jr., and that's kind of who he's replacing. So you think about it from that perspective. There's depth as well, right? Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Zay Jones all had career years. All are very different receivers. And then you have Travis Etienne Jr., who was extremely explosive. Among the 31 running backs with at least 175 rushing attempts, Etienne was third in breakaway percentage. So it just kind of shows you his ability that once he gets going, he is very tough to catch, and usually you see some large chunk runs. The biggest question mark, to your point, is Jacksonville's offensive line. Right? It's like, what do they have up front? Can you protect Trevor Lawrence? Doug Peterson identified this pretty early on last year, right? And you can kind of scheme around this. You don't want to, right? But you can scheme around it, and Doug Peterson smartly got the ball out of Trevor Lawrence's hands very quickly last season to kind of mask that inability of the pass protection. So Lawrence got it out on average in about 2.51 seconds, but you could see in some of just the offensive line metrics, Jacksonville's 31st in pass block win rate. And now you think about some of the issues, right? Like starting right tackle Juwan James left in free agency, signed an $80 million deal. Your starting left tackle Cam Robinson suspended the first 4 games after getting popped for PEDs. And so Anton Harrison's being thrown into the fire. He's going to start at right tackle day 1. He's got great feet, right? But the vibe pre-draft was like Harrison would need a redshirt season to kind of work on his strength. But he's getting thrown into the fire. Supposedly he's looked pretty good in the first preseason game. Walker Little, the second-round pick in 2021, is being asked to start at left tackle. Hasn't been good his first 2 years. Was terrible in the preseason opener, so we'll see what comes of that. Ben Barch, the perceived starting left guard, was just activated 2 days ago. Jacksonville also signed Bobby Evans off the street that plays guard. Not good. So like that left guard position, let's kind of keep an eye on that. Luke Fortner started as a rookie last year. He has to improve. Played over 1,100 snaps, didn't record a single positive game grade, graded out 41st out of 43 qualifying centers last year. The big money guy, right? The guy that's supposed to be the best of the group is guard Brandon Scherf. He has his worst season as a pro last year. Is it an anomaly? Is it an age, right? Going to be 32 pretty soon. But like past the obvious of why like offensive line play is really important, the one area where Trevor Lawrence did not progress last season was under pressure. Graded 33rd out of 40 qualifying quarterbacks when pressured. When kept clean, Lawrence graded out 4th. Only Mac Jones was more sensitive to pressure last season. I think the hope is, right, that Anton Harrison's feet allow him to transition quickly and at least be a plus pass protector, that Walker Little, holds the fort down for 4 weeks until Cam Robinson returns. Luke Fortner makes that year 2 leap, and Brandon Scherf returns to form that got him paid $50 million over 3 seasons. It's effectively a contract year for Scherf because Jacksonville has an out after this year. The other positive here is Jacksonville goes from facing the very toughest schedule of pass rushing defenses last season to an average schedule this season. So when I look offensively, the only way this doesn't improve is if the offensive line is just catastrophically bad. But you think about where they were last year. You think about, is it pretty difficult to be worse than 31st in pass block win rate, right? So you just kind of got to hold the fort down here a little bit. And if Trevor Lawrence can make any progression under pressure, like the offense should be good again and maybe even takes that next step.
Are you as optimistic this team has room to improve and can do so on the defensive side of the ball for a group that was ranked 24th in yards allowed, but significantly better in the points per game allowed category at 12th? Obviously, major issues from a defense that played a relatively easy schedule of opposing offenses, yet showed a knack for struggling way too consistently. They did generate a good pressure rate. The sack rate wasn't consistent with how often they were in the backfield. We've talked over the last couple of years in previewing the Jaguars how much money they spent to try and bolster this defense. And while you look at the guys that you expect more from, they haven't gotten the kind of production that you need from a Josh Allen and some of the other guys that they've used high draft picks. Clearly going to need more from Travon Walker, knowing that he was the first overall pick in the draft last year. But when you look at the Jags stop unit, we know that the offense has a piece to build around in Trevor Lawrence. Do you feel as optimistic that defensively this team can take a step forward and look like the kind of group that is a rightful favorite to be division champs?
There's no sugarcoating this. Like Mike Caldwell, Jacksonville's defensive coordinator, needs a big year. I mean, he spent 10 years with Todd Bowles at 4 different stops, so we liked Caldwell's pedigree. But bleak, right? I mean, year 1 was wildly disappointing, and there weren't many like unfortunate variables that you could point to and say like, hey, that's the reason why we weren't very good defensively. Like, I mean, Jacksonville played the easiest schedule of offenses in the entire league. Jacksonville had the second healthiest defense. Jacksonville recovered opponent fumbles at the 4th highest rate. It was just a piss poor defense, but it was one of the 5 youngest. And there's multiple key cogs that, you know, haven't quite scratched the surface yet. You're expecting, you know, a couple of those guys to have 2nd and 3rd year surges, and that's how this unit's ultimately going to improve. The interior was very good last year, stopping the run. I mean, Jacksonville was 6th in EPA per rush allowed, 11th in schedule adjusted run defense. So that was like the one area that they could hang their hat on a little bit and say, hey, you know, pretty good here. Davon Hamilton finally turned that corner in year 3, became a plus run defender, 18% tackle rate on run stops. Faudakowski like signed a big deal last offseason. He was a bust, you know, worst season of his 5-year career, graded 120th in run defense out of 142 interior linemen, dead last in tackling. So, I mean, that was a guy that they signed almost $30 million. He's got to be better. Robertson Harris is the veteran of the group, replacement level player. Jacksonville did sign Dwayne Smoot to a 1-year deal. Great pressure guy from the inside, 12% pressure rate on pass rush snaps the last 2 seasons. Did tear his Achilles in December, so we'll see what that looks like. My guess is, you know, does not start the season himself. The edge position is interesting. There were question marks, obviously, about Trayvon Walker. And it is very early on, but he played 800 snaps as a rookie. Did not have the year you'd hope for from the first overall pick. Below replacement level, 8% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, 19% missed tackle rate. Josh Allen is the horse of this group. I mean, he has improved each of his first 4 seasons. Last year, he was an absolute menace, 18% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Allen was top 20 in quarterback hits, set the edge like a monster. He is in, you know, he's about to get paid. And then if you're following this closely, like Jadeveon Clowney continued the free agency tour. He was in Jacksonville Monday to meet with Doug Peterson. Clowney has an offer on the table from Baltimore. So let's kind of see how this plays out. But I think it would be a big get for Jacksonville because we don't know what Trayvon Walker is, even if he kind of becomes the dude in year 2. Like, who's the 3rd guy on the edge for the Jaguars? I mean, you know, some of those young guys who have not panned out yet that you referenced at the top, one of them is Caleb Von Chasen, was a 1st-round pick in 2020. Been a bust to this point.
SEC for life, baby, along that defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not good. And then it's basically, you know, the rookie 5th-rounder Yasir Abdullah out of Louisville. So there's not a ton of great depth on the edge. Linebacker group is fun. Like, Oluwakun was, you know, as advertised, best season as a pro, led the league in positive play tackles. But, you know, where the improvement should come from is his running mate, right? Devin Lloyd. Metrically had a horrific rookie season, which was a shock to me because he was so polished at Utah. He was fantastic in coverage at Utah, but he really struggled last year. Graded 78th out of 93 qualifying linebackers. I expect a big leap in year 2. Secondary has to be better. Finished 30th in pass efficiency against the 3rd easiest scheduled passing offenses. I did like the improvement of Tyson Campbell, made that sophomore surge. Look at his numbers, allowed less than 10 yards per reception, was fringe top 10 in adjusted yards allowed per coverage snap among outside corners as well. Darius Williams was the big signing last offseason. Right, he's small guy. His play was extremely uneven. Things did shift a little bit late when they moved Williams from the slot to left corner. Trey Herndon has been a below replacement level player for all 5 seasons in the league, but he moved to the slot the final 3 games of the season, played the best of his career. Maybe that unlocks something for Herndon. And then all the hype out of camp is that Andre Sisco has taken that next step. That'd be huge. Rayshawn Jenkins is just average. But to me, when I look at the defense, like, still some holes, still a lack of depth. But, you know, if Jacksonville is going to play to market pricing, like, this defense needs to kind of push towards being, you know, closer to average, right? We can't be, you know, bottom 5. We got to be somewhere in that, you know, 14 to 19 range, and then hope that the offense takes another step forward.
When you look at Jacksonville and the way they're currently being priced in the market, I mean, we've said this is the litmus test that we use for all of these teams. We could think a group's going to be improved, but if the betting market reflects that, there's not going to be an opportunity to earn betting on them, so you may have to bet against them. Jacksonville, of course, draws the first place schedule. So when you look at the unique 3 opponents they're going to face this year, the Chiefs, the Bills, the 49ers. This is a group that plays just 1 game on Thursday night. It's a road trip in the wake of a divisional game where they'll go to the Saints, who we think will be improved. They play back-to-back games in London. Does this schedule allow for the Jaguars to show that level of improvement like the betting market indicates?
So let me preface it this way. If you were someone who is bullish on the Jaguars, to me, the way to attack this would not be seeing if they could achieve 10 wins against a very difficult AFC, but kind of parsing things out and saying, hey, let's just have them be the best among the shit. And that's the way that the professional bettors that I speak to who wanted to attack Jacksonville ultimately elected to get some money into the market on the Jaguars in terms of having a positive season, is they were focusing in on the AFC South specifically and saying, hey, let's just be better than what's here in this little silo of ours, as opposed to thinking about them, competing amongst the best of the AFC.
There's a lot to be said about being a big fish in a small pond, a little bit different when that fish gets released into the ocean waters and has to contend with some of the elite powers that are there. I mean, that's the one thing that we've seen from the AFC as we are on the cusp of wrapping up our third division, that there don't appear to be a whole lot of easy outs, and that's before we get to the defending Super Bowl champions, what we'll preview in the AFC West, later next week. The final team in this division, Payne, is, of course, the Tennessee Titans, and it's a group that looked like they had the division on lockdown last year before they limped to the finish, both literally and figuratively. The Titans coming up just short, starting Josh Dobbs in a win-to-get-in scenario, and it was a fumble 6 that cost them against that Jags team in a game where they dominated the stat sheet, just couldn't convert some of those drives into touchdowns. When we look at the Tennessee Titans season-long numbers here, a shade less than 3-1 to win the division, which makes them second favorites behind the Jaguars. The win total, 7.5, slightly shaded to the over, depending on the book where you're shopping. And as far as big picture numbers, just less than 50-1 to win the AFC and north of 100-1 to win the whole thing. We mentioned they started 7-3. They were north of 1-20 favorites at one point, proceeded to lose 7 straight once the injuries mounted. And, of course, the season finale was all she wrote. They finished this season with the third most adjusted games lost, depending on a lot of the metrics that you look at. And most of those injuries did come along the defensive side. But when you lose Ryan Tannehill and have to hand the baton to quarterbacks that clearly weren't ready to lead the offense, it obviously doesn't pay dividends. The one thing when we look at Mike Vrabel and what he's been able to accomplish as head coach of the Titans, he's been an underdog in 39 games. His team hasn't just gone 20-19 ATS in those spots. They've won 20 of those games outright. They're the only NFL team to be 500 or better when being lined as an underdog since 2020 with a minimum of 15 games. When you look at how their season went, they led 11 games through 3 quarters, the 6th most in the NFL, but it was a fourth quarter point margin that ultimately did them in. And Payne, a lot of that had to do with offensive play calling. They started the game exceptionally well, but oftentimes when you watch this team in the third and fourth quarter, it was 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. Can Tim Kelly leading the offense makes this team a little bit more dynamic? It appears that Ryan Tannehill will have a chance to be the starter for this team going into the season. We know Derrick Henry's getting up there in years. The offensive line has some question marks. But when you look at this Tennessee Titans team on the offensive side of the ball, is there reason to believe they can be better than what we saw last year?
Let's freaking hope, just based upon better health, although, a little scary yesterday. I think we've been banging the same drum for years with the Titans offense, and our loyal listeners
Throw on first down, Titans.
I mean, there's a very clear understanding of what Derrick Henry is and what he's meant to Tennessee's offense, but you can't be 30th in pass rate over expectation and compete in this league anymore. I mean, you just look and the last 6 Super Bowl winners have had a pass rate that averages out to be 4th highest in the NFL. And, I mean, the Titans threw it 11% less than expected relative to their down and distance last year. Treylon Burks was taking that next step. Everything that I heard was extremely positive, and obviously dealing with a little bit of an injury now. I think the news is extremely fortunate based upon, what it could have been. And then obviously the Titans go out and win a bidding war for DeAndre Hopkins. Tim Kelly promoted to OC, which you mentioned. He was the Titans passing game coordinator. So, I mean, time to put the ball in the air a little bit more, right? And I think what's disturbing, honestly, is like, it'd be one thing if Tennessee was actually efficient with all of the predictable early down runs, but the Titans are 29th in running back EPA per rush on first down. It's why defenses loaded the box at an 87% clip on first down. Just mind-boggling. And then when you look at first down, the first three quarters, when the Titans actually passed, right, when they finally said, hey, we're going to break tendency here, maybe give a little surprise to the defense. Fourth in EPA per pass. And I think we've chronicled this over time. Like, Ryan Tannehill is a quarterback that you need to make life easier for, right? He's not the guy that's going to be above average when asked to throw on second and long and third and medium plus, especially behind an offensive line that was 26th in pass block win rate. I mean, imagine paying Ryan Tannehill, of all guys, right, $118 million over 4 seasons and passing the ball at the third lowest rate relative to expectation. It's just banana land to me. And I think, one thing we've talked about for years is like, and I saw it weekly when Tannehill was with Miami. It's like, the man needs play action, right? And when you run at the rate the Titans do, there's absolutely no reason Tannehill isn't throwing with play action at the league's highest rate. But he only threw with play action 27% of the time. It was the 14th highest rate among qualifying quarterbacks. You look at Ryan Tannehill last season, graded out QB 10 of 41 qualifiers when throwing with play action, QB 21 without play action. The splits were even more severe in 2021. Tannehill was QB 3 with play action. And the Titans last season were 5th in the NFL in EPA per pass when they used play action on early downs. Like, it's right there in front of them. Like, it's very apparent. My hope is that things change a little bit. My understanding is, like,
there we go. Get to the 21st century.
There's some guys in that front office that have been reaching out to the right people. Let's see if this actually takes shape. So, I mean, just more play action, not being so predictable, right? That's going to help your offensive line. And I think that's paramount when you look at Tennessee's offensive line this year, like breaking in a new starting 5. Andre Dillard, first round pick in 2019. He's going to be Tennessee's starting left tackle, only played 700 snaps in 3 seasons with Philly. Couldn't become a full-time starter. Wasn't great to start camp, but I'm hearing has trended much, much better. You have Peter Skoronski, the 11th pick, who is kicking inside to guard. Titans O-line coach has said Skoronski has been absolutely awesome. The one holdover, Aaron Brewer. He is going to move from guard to center. Brewer's been a below replacement level player for 3 seasons, and now obviously as a center, like you're heaping more responsibility on him, so I don't know how that's going to look. Daniel Brunskill is going to start at right guard, played 4 seasons for the 49ers, a little bit of a mixed bag there. 2 really good seasons in 2019 and 2022 as a pass protector, but then you look at 2020 and 2021 when Brunskill played almost 2,200 snaps combined over those 2 seasons. He was a liability in pass protection. Starting right tackle, you have NPF suspended the first 6 games. So the Titans went out. They signed Chris Hubbard off the street 3 weeks ago. He's a 10-year vet. He's only played starter snaps 3 times, and it was more like earlier in his career, so I don't really know what he is. I mean, I think you kind of survive in advance and until, NPF returns. So there's some clear concern about the Titans O-line. And, those are kind of the 2 factors for me is like Tennessee's play calling and the O-line. I think we know what Derrick Henry is, and if the play calling's better, I think Henry's efficiency can increase. And that probably lessens our fear of Henry hitting that wall. There was some tiny regression in his numbers last year, but again, like, Malik Henry's your quarterback, and you're not throwing the ball, and you're predictable, like those numbers are going to decrease. But in totality, right, it's like Henry's averaged 367 touches the last 4 seasons. One of those years, he only played 8 regular season games. So, like, you kind of need to lighten Henry's load, make the runs more efficient, and play calling does that. A lot of people are down on DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe they're right. Maybe his body is broken. But you look at Hopkins last year, and you're well aware of this because he was on your fantasy team. I mean, it was clear defenses still feared him. I mean, they gave Hopkins, the largest cushion in the NFL, which is bizarre because he's not really known as a burner. But Hopkins had the 4th best route win rate among qualifying receivers. So he's still got juice in the tank. A few pro bettors who have access to information took a flyer on the Titans to win this wide open South Division plus 450 a week before Hopkins got signed. Obviously, not happy about the Treylon Burks injury situation. But, he showed flashes last year, had some uneven performances, Burks, but he kind of showed that potential the first 2 weeks of the season, then again in week 11, 12, 13, and 17. So, his peak is pretty good. And so hopefully, when he gets back healthy, Burks can kind of put it all together. I think where the variance lies with Tennessee this season, when you think about this from a betting perspective, is with their general manager, Ran Carthon. Right, he's only been there 8 months, but you kind of just follow this path. It's nothing he's said and done meshes, right? So Carthon gets hired, and he's talking about he's up on the podium teams that play in January play tough defense and run the ball, and then Ran Carthon tries to trade Derrick Henry to the Eagles, right? And then there's this meeting in June where they kind of smooth things over, Henry and Carthon, and then in May. I can tell you, Carthon calls Atlanta to see if Arthur Smith in a crucial year 3 wants his former quarterback, Ryan Tannehill. Doesn't go through because the two can't agree on who eats the larger sum of money. And then Carthon goes up and trades for his quarterback of the future. It's Will Levis, right? So all of those things would kind of appear to be this rebuilding season, right? Levis is going to get snaps early, right? There's efforts to trade Henry and Tannehill. But then all of a sudden, Carthon goes out and wins a bidding war for a 31-year-old DeAndre Hopkins as if Tennessee's a piece away from competing for a Super Bowl, which we know they're not. So, Tennessee is going to be competitive relative to the South Division. I think the lone fear, if you're buying the Titans, is they have the 4th most difficult schedule the first 6 weeks of the season. So the Titans have to tread water well enough for Carthon not to blow this entire thing up and kind of usher in the youth movement during that Week 7 bye.
So what you're telling me is if you believe you want to try and capture a price on the Titans to win the division, wait for them to start slowly, hope they don't blow it up, and maybe they can pull a reversal from last year where they look to be in the catbird seat leading down the stretch, completely cratered, that they could start slow but gain some momentum within the landscape of the division. Defensively, Payne, for the Tennessee Titans, it was a group that was absolutely ravaged, primarily in the secondary where they struggled mightily to get healthy bodies out there. It was a glorified pass funnel because this team was great against the run, but teams didn't have to run the football into their defensive front because you could play pitch and catch over the top like it was 7-on-7 football. We know that this team has committed a lot of resources to the defensive line, most notably Jeffrey Simmons getting a deal just shy of $100 million, and rightfully so, given what he means to that particular group. Harold Landry missed all of last year with a torn ACL, gives them another accomplished pass rusher. Danico Autry, kind of an unheralded cog in what they were able to do. They get Arden Key in on a 1-year deal from Jacksonville, hoping that he can produce a little bit of pass rush. Linebacking group, I'll leave to you in terms of trying to figure that out, but it feels like the secondary with just some level of increased health is a potential position group that has the largest opportunity to make a massive leap from 2022 to 2023, and not just on this team or in the division, but maybe the entire NFL.
You hate to bag on Vrabel because of the injury situation the last few seasons, but we're now in year 6, right? 5 seasons so far in Tennessee, Mike Vrabel's defense has finished with an average efficiency rank of 19th, never better than 12th. It has to be better on this side of the ball when you're led by a defensive-minded head coach. That is a disciple of Bill Belichick, period. And all the outside factors point in a positive direction for the Titans, right? Fumble luck, field goal luck, injury luck, right? Should all regress positively at the same time. The Titans had the most injured defense in the NFL by a mile, 26 and a half more adjusted games lost due to injury on defense than the second most injured defense. So all of that is positive to your point, especially in the secondary. The schedule of offenses the Titans project to face, bottom 7 in the league, right? Colts and Texans twice, both starting rookie quarterbacks. Panthers starting a rookie quarterback. Falcons and Steelers starting young second-year quarterbacks. The Buccaneers might be starting Kyle Trask, right? There's just no excuses for Vrabel. The defensive line, to your point, has a ton of dudes. Jeffrey Simmons, one of the best inside, can get after the quarterback and stop the run. Needs to tackle better. Danico Autry, you mentioned, graded out the Titans' best defender last season, 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, and that's just, from a guy who's 290, and he plays like the interior line edge in the 3-4. I mean, that's just massive. And he played well against the run. Autry did. Tart made a massive year 3 leap, improved each of his first 3 seasons. So you have this like trio of Simmons, Autry, and Tart that were fantastic. It led to an elite run defense. Tennessee was number 1 in yards before contact per rush allowed. It led to the Titans being number 1 in both EPA per rush allowed and rushing success rate allowed. I'm also hearing that there is a second-year interior lineman in Jaden Peavy who is having a monster camp to the point where he could steal real snaps here. So nice to have that 4th guy in the interior rotation there for Tennessee. You mentioned Harold Landry on the edge. He's going to return towards ACL in practice before the season started. That was roughly going to be 12 months out from that. 12% pass rush win rate there last year, or in 2021 rather. You mentioned Arden Key as well. This to me, I can't figure out the Arden Key thing, right? There was some like off the field issues early on in his career. Keep signing like these small deals, and it's another 1-year prove-it deal here. The light has come on for him the last 2 seasons. I'm surprised someone hasn't committed like a 2 or 3 year deal to him. 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps between the 49ers and Jaguars the last 2 seasons combined. He was fantastic against the run as well. He was good in coverage to boot last year for Jacksonville. I think the Jaguars could miss him a little bit. Then you have Rashad Weaver. Kind of an interesting name to mention. He was a 4th-round pick in 2021. Broke his leg as a rookie, was serviceable in year 2, but just improved very good. He works out down here in South Florida, and I was told made a complete body transformation. So if he's there and makes another leap in year 3 and kind of proves to be that 3rd guy off the edge, that would be massive for the Titans. Linebacker room, I think it regresses a little bit. You lose David Long. It's a big loss. He's just so versatile, very good in coverage. The Titans went out, signed Azeez to a 1-year prove-it deal. He was the 3rd guy in the 49ers rotation, had a monster season against the run, graded out 14th among 83 qualifying backers against the run. 55% of Azeez tackles graded out positively last year. So this is kind of a big year for him to say, like, hey, I can be the leader of a linebacker group. Past him, though, some question marks, like Jack Gibbons, undrafted free agent rookie last year. He's in line to start. Monte Rice is providing some competition there. Overall, though, the secondary has to make that leap you mentioned, right? I mean, Vrabel brought in a new secondary coach, and Chris Harris. Harris has had some good stops and some production along the way. Injury health should improve. The Titans are projected to face a bottom 7 schedule of pass offenses. That helps. So, there's some positives here to kind of project, an improved pass defense. I do still wonder a little bit about the Jimmies and Joes back there. Like, Christian Fulton is starting at 1 corner spot. He's their cornerback 1. Outside the top 55 in yards allowed per coverage snap on the outside. Needs to be better in year 4. It is a contract year. Sean Murphy-Bunting was a great value add in mind for $3.5 million among corners with at least 400 snaps last season. Bunting graded out 8th in coverage among 102 qualifiers. Roger McCreary was the Titans' 2nd-round pick last season, was forced to play over 1,100 snaps, should be better this season. Elijah Molden, the 2021 3rd-round pick, flashed as a rookie, limited by injury last season, solid player. And then you have Kevin Byard, just an elite do-it-all safety. You never have to worry about him. Amani Hooker only played 9 games last season due to injury. If he can play to like the 2021 form, that would be huge. Depth is the concern in the back. But, again, like if Christian Fulton's your number 1, it's tough, right? He's just like an average guy so far, but you're hoping, right? He sees the dollars, and he plays big in a contract year. But the key again, like if Tennessee can somehow be a game or 2 back in the South Division heading into Week 8, and Carthon doesn't blow this thing up, there could be some real opportunity in division futures.
Look, I mean, the schedule sets up for the Titans to be competitive. Only 6 of their 17 games this year against teams that made the postseason last year, and 2 of those 6 would be against the team that they want to get a little bit of revenge against in the division, the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Titans were 0-9 last year versus teams that made the playoffs. They took care of teams they should have and struggled when they stepped up in class, but there is no doubt when you talk about this team, and I listen to you break down the offense and defense, that there may be a higher floor than people are led to believe, even if the ceiling is capped among some of the heavyweights in the AFC.
And that's maybe all it takes in this division, right? Just a little bit of consistency.
Hey, consistency is key. And look, Jacksonville not used to having a target on their back. We know sometimes it can be a little bit difficult when you go from being the hunter to the hunted. And I know it's a cliche that we use all the time in terms of assessing some of the betting markets, looking to glean a little bit of value that's out there. But it could no doubt resonate in terms of the AFC South pecking order as far as the 2023 season. We mentioned the injury to Treylon Burks briefly in our breakdown of the Tennessee Titans. And the reason we did that is because there's someone that knows a heck of a lot more in terms of what we can expect in terms of Burks, how long he may miss, when he could return, along with some of the other key injuries impacting some difference makers in the AFC South. You can follow the good doc Deepka Chona on Twitter at SportMDAnalysis as he provides his injury update like he's done for each division thus far.
Are you injured or are you hurt?
When injuries occur in the NFL, you need someone to call on.
If you're hurt, you can still play. If you're injured, you can't.
Let's check in with Dr. Deepka Chona, Stanford and Harvard-trained orthopedic sports surgeon and founder of Sports Med Analytics, the industry leader in data-driven injury analysis.
So are you hurt or are you injured?
All right, thanks guys. Now, the AFC South is actually one of the healthier divisions overall, but big-time injury news just went down yesterday. Titans wide receiver Treylon Burks sprained his LCL in a hyperextension injury in training camp. Now, that averages 2 to 4 weeks. There is somewhat of a range with that, but there's a good chance that he's ready for week 1. Unfortunately, though, the thing to keep in mind is that these LCL sprains and knee sprains in general tend to be accompanied by a bone bruise. And these bruises are pretty painful. The only way to treat them is really rest. And as a result, they do tend to affect wide receiver performance metrics for about 6 weeks post-injury. So while Treylon Burks has an excellent chance to be ready to play week 1, we do anticipate him having a little bit less than 100% performance, usually by about 10% for the first 2 to 3 weeks of this season. Then we have also on the Titans, Harold Landry. Now recovering from an ACL, he is going to be about 12 months from injury when week 1 rolls around. So with his athletic profile, he's about an 80th percentile athlete, right in the middle of his prime at age 27. We do strongly anticipate him being ready early in the season, if not week 1. The key though is at his position, defense in general, and especially as a pass rusher, there does tend to be a performance hit from this type of injury. And that's simply because it's a lot of reacting, a lot of quick lateral movements are required. And as a result, for the first roughly 6 weeks of this season, our data does project a decline in Harold Landry's output. That should recover by the end of the season though. Then we have on the Texans, Tytus Howard. Now, he broke his hand. He had surgery earlier this month. They reported 4 to 6 weeks. I would say that 4 weeks is fairly optimistic. Depending on the position, players can sometimes return a little on the early side, and that would be about 4 to 5 weeks. However, with that being said, these injuries aren't really considered healed until about 6 weeks. So to return at 4 to 5, usually that means you're in some sort of cast that would restrict movement of the hand. And it's hard to imagine that not causing some level of performance dip if he does return early. With that being said, at week 6 to 7, as these do heal up, we do anticipate him returning. And to clarify, that's week 6 to 7 post-injury. So you're looking at the first couple weeks of the season. And we don't anticipate having any immobilization needs for the hand at that point. So Tytus Howard should be pretty much near full strength. Then also on the Texans, it's worth mentioning Scott Quessenberry, the center. He did tear his ACL earlier in camp this year, so he's of course out for the year. That could be a big factor in their overall O-line shifts. And then last but definitely not least, the guy who's been in the headlines all summer long, Jonathan Taylor. Now he's reportedly on his way back to practice and training camp this coming week. With that being said, we look at Jonathan Taylor's most recent injury. He did have a series of ankle issues last year and then had a relatively straightforward ankle surgery to clean it up over this offseason. Now, the short-term results on this injury and surgery are relatively promising in that we don't see running backs have lower performance metrics, and that tends to be true across multiple sports. So again, the short term, the 2023 outlook for Jonathan Taylor is relatively promising. The key to keep in mind here, though, is that for fantasy football, you're looking at the season-long injury risk for a player. And with that, you're really looking at their touch distribution, and that does tend to play a pretty significant role. In general, rushes carry a higher injury risk per play than receptions, and that seems to be pretty consistently true in our data. And what we find is probably the reason there is that rushes tend to be more central on the field, whereas receptions are more likely to put a player in sort of a peripheral position. And with that, they tend to be more chaotic, and it's harder to brace for hits that you can't necessarily see coming when you're running the ball up the gut. And so with Jonathan Taylor, you tend to want actually the opposite of his touch profile ratio, and that is specifically you want a high ratio of receptions to carries for your round one running backs for fantasy football. Jonathan Taylor, of course, is reversed on that. So keep that in mind. No real red flags in his injury history, but does project as a little bit of a risky player for that reason. And that's all we have for today, so we will kick it back over.
You know, listening to that, Payne, hearing about it being an LCL sprain and a potential bone bruise that comes along with it, far be it for me to say it's the best case scenario since you and I aren't the ones suffering from that particular injury, but it's a hell of a lot better from a silver lining standpoint than a torn ACL where a player that you talked about making major strides, at least in his second camp, and an ability to be a bona fide number 2 opposite DeAndre Hopkins will be back out there. It just may take him a little bit longer to get up to full speed.
Yeah, I mean, when you saw the injury and you saw him hobble around and then needed to be carted off, you're like, ooh, you know, this is he's done. And so to kind of get the report 12 or so hours later, that's an LCL, and you know that recovery timeline is very short. The bone bruise more of the pressing matter, and even it sucks, right? Because we're talking about the toughest part of the Titans schedule, the first 6 weeks. So if he's not himself until, you know, week 4, that sucks a little bit for that key transition we're talking about where they need to be competitive, you know, early on in the season to kind of keep the veterans around and make that push in the division. So unfortunate from that perspective, but a guy that seems to have made that leap heading into year 2.
Maybe there's a Derek Mason or a Kevin Dyson they can get out of the retirement home to fill in for the first 3 weeks. Because, you know, those guys can come out, they can flash. The recovery may not be there, but if you get enough veterans to fill in for weeks 1, 2, and 3, opposite DeAndre Hopkins, it may soften the blow a little bit. You can follow Payne on X at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, we're getting into the nitty gritty. By my count, we have 4 best bets already through the first 4 divisions. We have 4 to go. You told us going in that we might not have all 8. Is this the week where we break our streak, or what have you potentially found to try and allow our loyal listeners to get their money into the market early and have a season-long sweat?
It's a little dry out there. Let's phrase it that way. And there's a couple things that we like, but the price has moved, and so I'm actually going to give you something that we have not quite bet yet. Our plan is to bet this later today, and I wanted to see what it looked like. We've talked about this team a little bit earlier in our preview series. And the information that I got seems to mesh with the one data point we have, and so kind of want to attack that before the market fully is cognizant of this. But I think with Todd Monken, the Baltimore offense is going to open up. And I mentioned this on the AFC North preview, and what I was hearing was Louisville 2.0. Get Lamar in the shotgun, spread things out. If he does take off and run, it's into lighter boxes. And the first preseason game is any indication, Baltimore was in 3 wide receiver sets, 11 personnel, 81% of snaps. Last year, just 10% dead last in the NFL. So you get the data confirmation, and I know it's the preseason, but you get that data confirmation to mesh with everything you were hearing informationally. And the last 2 seasons, Lamar was on pace to go over his number of this year, right, which is 23.5 touchdown passes before the injury. The weapons around Lamar are the best he's ever had. Pass rates are going to increase with Todd Monken. I think they'll have to regardless, because I don't think Baltimore has a top 5-ish defense like it had last year. And that will push the Ravens offense a little bit more as well. Baltimore faces a bottom 10 schedule of passing defenses. And the last time Lamar started a year from scratch with, a new offense was 2019. He threw for 36 touchdowns. In 2020, threw for 26 touchdowns. So I think this number is a little light based on the priors, based on offensive systems, based on injuries back-to-back seasons. So I think we're getting a little bit of a price break on Lamar Jackson over 23.5 passing touchdowns. I expect this offense to open up a little bit this year.
These are the kind of nuggets that you're supposed to wait until after I have my fantasy draft. So Lamar Jackson continues to fall. Everybody runs over men, women, and children to draft the likes of Justin Fields or Jalen Hurts, hoping that he can put together a season like last year. So when you share these tidbits, a lot of the competition that I go head-to-head with takes them to heart, and they're now going to slide Lamar Jackson up a couple rounds. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Actually, I hope our listeners appreciate it. You ruining my day by giving this out publicly.
Yeah, everyone loves when Todd has a bad day.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. There are people in my own household who like when I have a bad day. And on this podcast as much as anything else. By the way, an injury.
And you still proposed.
Yeah, well, you know what happened. I mean, there's a lot of people that say
desperation sets in after 40.
I wasn't going to go there. I was going to say there were a lot of people who told me I could make my life more difficult by having an Italian as my business partner, having an Italian as my spouse. So apparently I've made some interesting choices along the way. One injury.
You're a patient human.
Yeah, one injury. Not massive, but it does impact the team that we previewed about an hour ago in terms of the receiving core. Ashton Dulin, the wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, saw Adam Schefter report torn ACL. So a team that didn't have a ton of weapons. He's officially listed as a second stringer on their depth chart. May give more opportunity to Josh Downs, but it does take away a big body should something happen to Michael Pittman Jr. or Alec Pierce. So Ashton Dulin out with a torn ACL this season. Never what you like to see for a young quarterback trying to figure things out. All right, my friend, AFC South officially done and dusted. Anything else you'd like to share with our loyal listeners before we reconvene on Monday to talk a little NFC South and the Atlanta Falcons hype train that's leaving the station?
Over the hump, down the stretch we come.
Look at that. 3 preview podcasts to go. I want to, again, take this opportunity to remind all of our loyal listeners, those division previews, we know they're long endeavors. Listen one team at a time. Go back, listen once, twice, 3 times. You have 11 college football previews as well. Week 0 will be here a week from Saturday. So if you haven't taken in all of those shows, the SEC was the crown jewel in our stable. Nearly 3 hours of college football content that is unrivaled anywhere in the space. Like, rate, review, offer up those 5 stars. We know Payne will get generous with the pocketbook as we get closer to the season as well. But want to thank all of you loyal listeners for sharing this podcast with your friends and family, continuing to listen. 3 preview shows to go. But in the interim, with a Lamar Jackson touchdown passes over the posted total season-long prop, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.